All right, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to today's SANS webinar. Continuing our series with SANS and Dragos working together to put out some content to the community, useful to everyone on general topics, especially those that we face day to day in the ICS security community. Today's webinar's focus is on why you need OT-specific threat intelligence. We've seen a lot of discussions around threat intelligence, what it can and can't do, and having this content hopefully will enable you in the mission that you do to keep the lights on, the water flowing, our manufacturing goods protected. So again, thank you for what you do, especially during all these crazy times. I'm your moderator for today, Robert Lee. I'm a SANS course author and senior instructor over in the ICS curriculum. And today we have two wonderful speakers who are going to take you through this presentation. First up, we have Selena Larson. She is a Dragos threat intelligence analyst. She has a very, very interesting career, coming from a background starting out at CNN as a journalist, and having a long journalism career before that. But then coming over to Dragos, doing the intel role, starting out kind of doing technical editing and reporting, quickly cutting her chops, becoming a very senior intel analyst and capability on sort of the strategic analysis side, and honestly being able to bridge the world that we have today in terms of how intel is created as well as consumed by companies, because that ends up being a gap for a lot, is how do I make sense of this intel stuff? In addition, we have Reid Weitmann, a senior principal vulnerability analyst and intelligence analyst at Dragos. Reid is well known in the ICS security community, long background in our community, starting out both on the ICS OEM side, working at Schweitzer Engineering Labs, as well as on the government side of the house, doing some interesting work there. And also just being active in our security research community in ICS for a long time, multiple S4 kind of presenter, multiple sort of being around the block at SANS ICS before coming over to Dragos, and just actively contributing to a lot of discussions, everything from sensor level security to vulnerabilities to what we're doing for the supply chain aspect. So his take today will be pretty relevant in what you all are facing as well. So without further ado, I'm going to end up turning it over to Selena, but as a just quick housekeeping note, today's slides and video are recorded. They'll be available for you at the SANS link that you registered. And if you could please use the Q&A option, not the chat option, in Zoom to answer your questions, and I'll moderate those at the end for our speakers. With that, Selena, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. And thank you so much to SANS for giving us this opportunity to chat with you all today. By way of introduction, this is Selena Larson. You hear my voice. I am, again, like an intelligence analyst at Dragos, specifically focusing on industrial cybersecurity. In my role, I do a lot of identifying and reporting on threats, trends, and ICS-specific tactics, techniques, and procedures.
And I am Reid Weitmann, a vulnerability researcher here, and I swear I only started a fire one time in the office, but I do a lot of hardware reverse engineering and pen testing and trying to find a lot of novel vulnerabilities in industrial equipment specifically.
He says only in the office once, but he works from home, so the count is undetermined.
We have fire extinguishers, it's good.
So going over the agenda today, real briefly, I kind of want to define cyber threat intelligence in general, talk about ICS threat intelligence differentiators from more sort of traditional enterprise IT focused, defining the landscape that we see. We're going to get into some vulnerability intelligence discussions. Reid's going to dig into IT versus ICS architectural differences. And then we have a really interesting vulnerability case study for you coming up. It's timely and interesting. I highly recommend you take some notes there. And then we're going to discuss generating OT threat intelligence and operationalizing OT threat intelligence. So to kind of get us started, I would like to have us define what is cyber threat intelligence, just so we're kind of all on the same page here. Fundamentally, it is obtaining actionable information on adversaries, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and vulnerabilities, so defenders and organizations can reduce harm through better security decision-making. And there's two pieces that I really want to highlight here, right? So actionable information and reducing harm through decision-making. Threat intelligence is not useful unless you are able to take action on it. In every report, you want to make sure that you have the so what piece. And we're going to kind of get into that in just a little bit. So I thought we might be able to sort of start off with this kind of character presentation, right? So I kind of wanted to show you a couple of adversaries. It's certainly not the end all be all. This is not, I don't want to say that these are the only two in existence, but just an example of the characters that we're going to kind of be talking about as we get through this. So there's one group targeting the retail industry. They use spear phishing emails that will masquerade as business opportunities for initial access. They use commodity ransomware. The adversary is going to be largely cyber criminal with a target environment that's IT-focused business operations. From a TTP's perspective, that's spear phishing, commodity malware, installing a PowerShell backdoor. You have sort of data exfil related to financial data before, sort of locking down the computers and asking for a ransom. Then on the other side, you have an adversary that's interested in disrupting electric distribution. So this adversary might also use spear phishing emails related to business inquiries for initial access. They will leverage it to steal credentials, move through the environment, and access a dual home device that is connected to both IT and ICS networks. They'll use that pivot point to gain further access to hosts within the OT network. This adversary is going to be sufficiently resourced, likely sponsored or supported by an entity who wants to further political, national security, military, etc. means. Again, this target is going to be initial access in order to facilitate that ultimate OT access to achieve a disruptive or destructive goal or objective. And the TTPs here will be spear phishing, customized malware, and use of OT-specific devices and protocols.
Yeah, that use of OT-specific devices and protocols will become a bit more relevant as we look at the kind of vulnerability case study. So just keep that in mind.
So to kind of define the threat landscape. So we have these acronyms that are thrown around a lot, and a lot of you on the call might be familiar, but if not, operational technology, OT. OT should be thought of as mission critical IT in an ICS. It's the hardware and software that controls and monitors operations in an ICS environment like domain controllers and Windows PCs. Industrial control systems, ICS, this is an umbrella term for software and hardware that controls and automates industrial processes. ICS environments can include electric utilities, oil and gas, manufacturing, chemical processing, food processing, things like that. So we want to talk about some cyber threat intelligence, IT versus OT differentiators. So the adversaries, threat behaviors, and consequences of cyber attacks are going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk about how Dragos tracks 11 publicly tracked adversaries that are interested in targeting or potentially disrupting, facilitating access to the OT environment, and how the threat behaviors are going to be a little bit different. And I kind of want to key in here on the consequences of cyber attacks. So successful attacks can cause catastrophic human and environmental harm. ICS threat intelligence can help keep major disasters from happening. A really great example of this is going to be Trisis. So Trisis was the ICS-specific malware that targeted a safety instrumented system in Saudi Arabia back in 2017. They were able to successfully infiltrate the ICS network and create malware that was specifically targeted to the safety equipment. Safety equipment within that environment was essentially used to keep people from dying and keep the environment safe. You do not want an explosion to happen at an oil and gas facility, for instance. Luckily, that did not occur. However, it did demonstrate the potential of the capability to that adversaries are sort of developing these ways of malware that could have this sort of disastrous consequences. And then finally, vulnerability impacts and the actions taken will really vary greatly. And this is an interesting piece, actually, that Reid is going to really dive into, especially with our case study coming up here in just a second. So from a categories perspective, really, what is ICS threat intelligence? Dragos kind of breaks them down into these three different categories. You have your interested adversaries, direct ICS impact, and indirect ICS impact. So when we talk about interested adversaries, this is referring to intelligence on activities of adversaries known to have an interest in control systems, operation networks, and ICS organizations. An example, Alanite. This is one of the activity groups that we have tracked that targets electric utility and energy firms, both here in the US and North America and elsewhere. It has the capability to infiltrate OT environments for reconnaissance purposes. That is, this adversary is very interested in accessing operations and potentially conducting some reconnaissance, information gathering in that environment. Then you have the direct ICS impact. So this refers to intelligence on threats directly affecting the operation of industrial control systems. Again, here's TRISIS. This is a malware framework designed and deployed to disrupt oil and gas operations, specifically targeting the safety equipment. Crash override, another really great example of malware that was targeted to switchgear and circuit breakers within a transmission environment and effectively cut power to Kiev in 2016. And then you have your indirect ICS impact. So this would be intelligence on threats that are not associated with industrial control systems, but have a high likelihood of disrupting their operation. For example, SonoKibi ransomware does not specifically target industrial control systems. However, it can be debilitating to organizations if it accesses operational networks. Talking about improper segmentation, having a really flat network. If they're able to very easily transition via credential theft and reuse from the enterprise environment over into ICS due to improper security controls, things like that. And I want to make it clear here too. We did mention ransomware when we're talking about the differences in these adversaries, right? But an indirect ICS impact is one thing. A direct ICS impact is something different and requires a deep knowledge and understanding, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So the threat landscape, again, is a lot different. These adversaries are largely focused on industrial entities and industrial control systems. And even though OT does have enterprise technology, a lot of it will require specialized knowledge. The adversary has to develop, special capabilities. They have to maintain access and learn 2 different networks that all require different types of behaviors to navigate. And this is largely because all ICS environments are not the same. So an adversary is going to have to kind of get in and learn the equipment, learn the network, learn how things communicate with each other. And even from the most basic levels. So for instance, a lot of plants have static routes which can't actually get to the internet. And effectively that kind of cripples command and control communications, which you don't necessarily see in enterprise. So even the most basic things of like learning routing, that takes time, right? And the good thing is, from a defender perspective, you are able to leverage that sort of long time adversary dwell time, leverage OT-specific threat intelligence that describes the behaviors of these adversaries within an operations environment, be able to sort of key in on even these sort of living off the land techniques that are unique to ICS, for instance. A PLC will be remotely operated from an HMI that has been accessed via VPN. Right? So you can kind of use threat behaviors to identify these patterns, identify these behaviors, and stop the adversary while they are still kind of learning and going throughout the environment to prevent a sort of catastrophic attack. The components of threat intelligence might be similar in both the enterprise as well as OT. For instance, using indicators of compromise, this idea of threat behaviors, right? So TTPs. But the behaviors themselves are going to be a little bit different. Again, kind of talking back to TRISIS, going back to TRISIS, right? The attack path that that Xenotime, which is the TRISIS attacker, the attack path that Xenotime took is a lot different than what you might see from, for instance, a IT-focused sort of commodity adversary. And then finally, the decision-making calculus is going to be a lot different, right? So are you going to be willing to sort of take the risk? Are you accepting the risk of what might happen in your environment? Or are you going to take things offline, let's say, to implement patches and lose millions of dollars in the meantime? Are you going to open a new office potentially in an area that is, really highly targeted by such adversaries, things like that. It's not just the security decision-making calculus, but the decision-making goes all the way through the organization. So when we're talking about, the threat landscape and the threat surface, what do we mean by that? So Dragos tracks 11 public activity groups that target ICS. This includes electric utilities, oil and gas, manufacturing, all from many, many different geographies. We track adversaries across the globe, including here in North America. And we consider Xenotime and Electrum to be the most dangerous due to their ability to create sort of ICS-specific, ICS-disruptive malware. And we're talking about Trisys or crash override. However, what we have seen is these adversaries sort of expanding their interests, expanding their capabilities and tools. You're seeing, sponsors investing a lot more information into, or a lot more money into sort of the development of these tools. You're seeing sometimes the commoditization of tools, like frameworks and modules being worked into hacking frameworks such as Mimikatz, for instance. So the barrier to entry sort of for developing this ICS specific malware might be decreasing, and the adversaries are sort of expanding their interests to multiple industry verticals. And then you have supply chain and third-party access. So oftentimes, we'll talk about supply chain, or we'll think about supply chain, and you kind of think of the sort of rice-sized chip on a on a motherboard that has sort of infiltrated all of these different companies. But that particular story is not realistic. But also supply chain can talk about the connections, the relationships, the partnerships, the vendors that you have these relationships with, whether that's directly within your environment, for instance, third-party access into operations by these vendors to be able to have push updates or help on maintenance, etc. But also sort of throughout the supply chain of the folks that you're working with, right? So a supply chain attack can even include something like a partner that you were working with has their email compromised, and it's used to send phishing lures to a target industrial victim. Original equipment manufacturers, we have seen Xenotime, for instance, targeting these companies, which could potentially, again, facilitate supply chain access. And then telecommunications is actually pretty interesting as well. This is something that we've seen demonstrated by Hexane. Hexane is a group that targets oil and gas operations as well as telecommunications, largely in the Middle East as well as parts of Africa. And telco networks are pretty valuable for ICS targeting attackers. This is because being able to sort of gain access to a mobile or satellite network could effectively allow the adversary to interact with operations that use the cell devices or satellite connections. We're talking, upstream, midstream operations related to oil and gas, potentially geographically dispersed energy generation like wind farms, things like that, that rely on sort of these mobile or satellite connections. Remote access and vendor access. This is something certainly that we've seen a lot of talk about, certainly recently with COVID, with everyone going to work remote, and a lot of times companies don't have remote work plans or schedules or whatever, like automatically implemented, right? It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of mistakes, certainly. And now even more people are having a remote access both to the enterprise as well as potentially operations as well, which kind of expands the sort of threat surface and opportunities to be able to sort of hijack those connections. Vendor access is another one. Again, we kind of mentioned it, access for maintenance purposes, for updates, etc. That's another sort of opportunity for an adversary to sort of leverage those trusted connections. And then you have systematic and input-output threats. And this is something that's pretty unique to industrial systems that you don't really see in IT. For instance, let's say an adversary wanted to attack coal power generation somewhere. They might go after the railways instead of just sort of stop or slow coal delivery so it actually can't get to the generation facility. And that could potentially lead to a lack of power, potential, issues with the folks and the communities that rely on this coal power. Another would be to effectively stop California power production. You could stop the natural gas pipeline from Vancouver, Canada, for more than 24 hours. That again, stopping the input to effectively have an output effect. So again, these are kind of the systematic threats that just really you don't see often. You just don't see that in the enterprise. So this is kind of interesting, and this is going to lead right into what Reid is talking about. But the cybersecurity principles, or fundamental principles of security within the enterprise and OT ICS are going to be different. Many of us are familiar with the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You want things to stay safe, you want them to be trustworthy, and you want them to be available. But you can't really take that framework and apply it into industrial processes. So, when we're talking about programmable logic controller is unavailable, like what does that mean? Is the logic like still working, but the operator can't change it? Is it still operating at all? Is it available to the operator, but just they can't implement logic to it? So what we effectively did at Dragos is to develop this sort of VICES model, which is view, input, output, control, engineering, and safety, to sort of expand those principles a little bit more to make sense for industrial processes. So view will refer to the ability to monitor or read a system state. Again, input output relates to the equipment that's actually used to communicate with an OT, as well as sort of the data that flows between these systems. Control refers to the ability to modify a system state. And like kind of what we talked about earlier, that could be either a hard loss, which is completely making the device unable to respond to inputs, or a soft loss, which the device keeps working and it continues to respond to inputs based on pre-programmed logic, but you as an operator can't do anything to it. Engineering will refer to the sort of physical controls and the specifications that are not linked to digital assets. For instance, a tube that can only get so hot before it melts or sort of fractures, or a centrifuge that can only spin within certain parameters before it breaks. And safety is perhaps the most important. There is obviously, they care about safety. We're seeing the potential ability to target safety instrument systems with very potentially lethal repercussions. But asset owners and operators will care about the safe and reliable power. They care about the safety of workers and the environment, chemical safety processes, food safety, all of this that could be impacted by targeted cyber attacks or operational disruptions. And with this, I'm going to go ahead and let Reid take it from here.
Sure, thanks, Selena. So Selena's talking about this VICES model. When we look at public advisories, hopefully this is actually going to advance slides on me. Why do things not work sometimes? When we look at public vulnerability advisories, in addition to not incorporating any industrial specific impacts, in those advisories, right? Those advisories are completely just displaying the kind of confidentiality, integrity, and availability impacts of vulnerabilities. We also review all of these public advisories, augment them with that data as part of our threat, our vulnerability intelligence process, but we also end up correcting a lot of those advisories. So we find a little over a quarter of the specific advisories that came out, for example, in 2019 had some, or actually it was slightly over 30% of those had corrections that needed to be made to the advisory. But we also look at those advisories and say, is there a patch available? Or if there's no patch available, at least does this advisory present some mitigation advice that would be meaningful to an engineer or operator? And we find that a lot of advisories fall short on both counts, right? They either have, totally incorrect information saying that either, an industrial vulnerability is not network exposed when truthfully it is, or they, come with no patch, and they might not even have any mitigation information included with the advisory. They might just say, hey guys, congratulations, you have a vulnerability. There's nothing actually actionable that you can take from that advisory to do anything about that. So, one of the problems that you run into with applying a patch anyway, let's say, you're one of the lucky 74% of advisories, or you own equipment that's covered by one of the lucky 74% of advisories, and you want to know, hey, should I actually apply this patch? Well, usually you're going to have to wait for an outage window. You may have problems with legacy hardware that might not necessarily support the latest firmware version that the vendor has just put out. So there are a lot of impediments to actually patching systems immediately. In addition, history is riddled with stories of a vendor producing a patch that ends up, causing a controller to crash, or causing some other malfunction within the industrial environment. So a lot of times people defer applying patches right away. They either, hopefully they are applying them in some sort of a test environment or development environment where they can, verify that yes, this works on, my hardware, my particular lab setup. So I'm confident that I can actually roll it out to the production network. Or they may just wait and see, hey, are other people applying this patch, and is it working for them? Or is it presenting more problems than it's helping? So, a lot of this, though, also depends upon the vendor actually producing those patches. So the case study we're going to look at is actually in a third-party component where the vulnerability is in some portion of firmware. Now the OEM of the actual equipment needs to incorporate that fix into their firmware before they can actually deliver it to the end users. So that means that it takes a long time to get these patches out. It seems like a lot more traditional IT or IoT devices are a bit more centralized, right? In other words, the vendor has either written the software themselves, they have more complete control over it, whereas a lot of these kind of specialty embedded devices, especially in the industrial space, tend to have more of these kind of OEM issues where the vulnerabilities can require coordination in order to release the patch. So an architectural difference in industrial equipment. I like to put a PLC in scare quotes because a PLC is the block here circled or squared off in red, right? It's in this red block. A PLC actually consists of a whole bunch of different processors, right? There is the main processing unit. That's the thing that runs your logic. If this is a PLC, this would be the thing that's actually running your ladder logic or structured text code or whatever you happen to program your PLC in. If it's something like a digital protective relay, it would be running your protection logic. That main processor is actually using a backplane to communicate with a bunch of add-in cards. Those add-in cards a lot of times end up having their own CPUs, and they may include something like an input module that has a processor that either debounces input or sanitizes input in some way, as well as output modules. So the idea is that a PLC or whatever controller you happen to have has these scan cycles where it's going to go query the input modules, say, hey, what is the status of all the sensors that you have attached to you? It's going to execute some logic based on its own internal state as well as the status of those input modules. And then it's going to finally update output modules. And again, those output modules may have their own processor in them. Some of them are more dumb devices, but some of them actually have pretty advanced, logic of their own, especially in safety systems where an output module might say, have code inside of it that says, hey, I haven't heard from the processor in a while. Something is up. Maybe the SIS has crashed and I need to set the outputs in this particular way. But anyway, that output module then will be clicking relays or adjusting its analog output signals to talk to the actual actuators out in the field. The key thing here is that a lot of PLCs and a lot of industrial equipment has a network card in it, and that network card is often distinct from the main processing unit. Now, it's not universally true. There are some kind of lower-end PLCs that tend to incorporate the network control with the processing unit, but a lot of the kind of higher-end equipment you'll see actually has this as a distinct component. And that actually becomes really important when we look at our case study vulnerability. And if slide advancing would work for me, that would be wonderful. All right, so the case study we're going to look at, you've probably heard of, is the Ripple 20 set of vulnerabilities. This was discovered by a company called JSOF, and they've done a really great job of coordinating the vulnerability research and impacts, especially with industrial equipment makers. but it's a set of 19 vulnerabilities that impact a lot of different devices. These include IoT devices as well as ICS devices. In the industrial space, you're going to see, we're already starting to see some of the advisories come out for this. A lot of programmable logic controllers, serial to Ethernet converters, protocol converters, remote terminal units, digital protective relays. I imagine we'll see some things like managed network switches, maybe even some, network gateways that are kind of Ethernet on both ends that are actually going to end up being impacted by this. So right now, of course, some vendors have come out with advisories for this, and some of those vendors have even started producing firmware patches, or at least providing some general mitigation advice. But kind of a lot of operators are in a holding pattern, right? So they're waiting for those vendors to, apply those fixes to their firmwares, run their firmwares through all the tests that need to be done, and then deliver those new firmware images to the customers. It's important, though, to remember that the Ripple 20 vulnerabilities, these bugs are impacting what we call deeply embedded systems. The actual protocol stack that's affected here is TREX, where they call it a TCP IP stack, but it's really a TCP and UDP IP stack. But this stack is written for small embedded operating systems that don't have a native internet protocol stack, right? So you have to think of operating systems like ThreadX, some versions of VxWorks, if somehow the vendor licensed it without its native IPnet stack. But in order for an attacker to use these kinds of vulnerabilities, these memory corruption bugs and other issues that are happening with the Ripple 20 series of 19 vulnerabilities, they really need to, the attacker really needs to do a lot of work to write a working exploit for this, right? They need to take apart equipment and say, what kind of processor is actually in this thing? They need to start reverse engineering the firmware and say, okay, this is just the IP stack, remember, there's actually an operating system that this IP stack is running on top of. The attacker needs to learn, what operating system is this? What's the memory layout of this operating system so that I can make this memory corruption bug work for me? And then they actually need to write the exploit that is actually going to work on the target system. For these reasons, I don't think we're going to see a lot of widespread full remote code execution attacks from the Ripple 20 bugs. There certainly will be targeted ones. I think the JSOF paper has an awesome example, which is a Digi serial converter. It's like a Digi wireless to serial converter adapter that a lot of OEMs may end up installing on products that have a wireless interface. But I don't think we're going to see this sort of widespread RCE attacks. I think more likely we're going to see denial of service style attacks, because the paper actually outlines a couple of the vulnerabilities and says, here's kind of a sample payload of a bunch of the A character that will overwrite some memory on the embedded device. That's enough to usually cause something to crash. And of course, a lot of industrial equipment may even have a watchdog chip in it. So if it crashes, the watchdog may detect it and decide to reboot the device, but it still would not be a great situation for an industrial operator to have, PLCs suddenly rebooting themselves, let alone crashing. This is usually a really bad thing to happen in an industrial environment. In fact, the loss of availability of a device would be probably the worst thing that could happen in an industrial environment. But we need to go back to our actual architecture of our affected devices, right? The Ripple 20 bug will typically live in this network card. So when an attacker is going after a PLC using the Ripple 20 bug, they're really targeting this one specific CPU in a component of the logic controller. And when earlier Selena was talking about our kind of two adversaries, you have the one that's kind of interested in making money. They're really not going to be using this bug, I don't think. I can't see a way to monetize, crashing PLCs, because I think if you did that to an operator and said, hey, I've crashed your PLCs, give me money and I'll stop, the operator is probably just going to go around and unplug a bunch of network cables and do some forensics and say, no, I'm not going to pay you. But if the operator is somebody that really wants to disrupt the attacker, I should say, somebody who really wants to disrupt operations and, cause some political shift or, achieve some, political goal, they're probably well-resourced, and there's a much better way to go after most industrial controllers, right? Most of these PLCs are still using a totally insecure protocol for programming them or even for issuing like remote operation commands. And this is where it's really important to think about the actual attack surface of an industrial piece of equipment when you're looking at a vulnerability, right? Because if the attacker is one of these, well-resourced folks that is going to spend the time to reverse engineer a piece of industrial equipment, they're much more likely to go after like an easy button, some insecure protocol that maybe they can just grab a couple of libraries off of the engineering software and figure out how it works and attack that protocol, rather than going through all the effort of hacking the network card when the network card isn't even getting you the end goal, which is the direct ability to manipulate the inputs and outputs on the controller. So kind of in conclusion on the Ripple 20 stuff, it's like in the industrial control environment, this bug can be used to affect a portion of a typical controller. And it's a lot more work, it turns out, to exploit a bug or even a series of bugs like this than it would be in traditional IT land. So when you look at something like the CVSS score, when CVSS score says, it's 9.8 because it can allow arbitrary code execution, you really need to sit back and say, okay, what does that actually mean? Now, I've looked at it in the context of a PLC. There's, of course, other industrial equipment that might be used on your network where that architecture falls apart. Some of the devices that were mentioned specifically in their paper happened to be UPSs. If you do a quick, architectural assessment of a network-connected UPS, sure enough, that network card can probably turn power off. So the ability to actually break into that network card may end up being more important, ironically, than the vulnerability in a PLC. And then there are a bunch of other vulnerabilities as part of the Ripple 20. I'm really focused on the, kind of code execution, memory corruption bits of that advisory. I think of the 19 bugs, I think 12 or something were kind of data theft portions where you can send some, malformed requests or even malformed responses to legitimate requests like DNS requests, and you can actually pull out some memory from one of the devices that's affected, basically stealing some data out of the device that you normally shouldn't have the ability to read. Those kinds of vulnerabilities are mostly irrelevant to the industrial space, again, because these devices are insecure by design. I think that those kinds of bugs are a lot more relevant to the IoT world where maybe there's some vendor lock-in. Of course, the IoT maker is probably selling the device at a loss with the promise that they will lock you into their service. Because they're locking you into their service, they probably have encryption keys in the device that are used for actually locking you in, and the ability to steal data off of a device like that could potentially give you those keys. So it's a lot more relevant to the IoT people than it necessarily is to the ICS folks. Presentation delay of moving slides forward. All right. So in addition to looking at just the device architecture, it's also, of course, good to look at network architecture. Selena's going to talk more about crown jewels in a second, but crown jewels would be the devices that are most important to you, that are most important to your process control. Those are the things that you really don't want to have exposed upstream. Things like PLCs, remote terminal units, protocol converters, digital protective relays. Those are not things that are likely to be exposed kind of upstream to your corporate network or even to the internet. Of course, if there are routers that those might be exposed, but it's best to review your own network architecture to decide before taking action. But I guess the key takeaways here really are to not panic about vulnerabilities like this, to step back and say, all right, what devices are actually affected by this? What is the system architecture of the device itself, and what can an attacker gain by using this? what is my overall network architecture, and is that providing me some protection? And this is always a good time to kind of review those segmentations within your network and say, okay, this bug has come out. Maybe there's no patch from my vendor yet. Let's review the firewall and say, you know, is this actually being restricted to the minimum number of things that need to talk to it? And then just think through those impacts, right? To say, hey, if an attacker gets onto my network card, what can they do? Versus what they could do with just having access to the controller in the first place. And again, a lot of vendors don't like to talk about the fact that they are insecure by design, but the literature is riddled with examples of those logic controllers and other things having those issues. And finally, you know, you can take all this information and decide whether it's prudent to patch now or whether these mitigations are going to be enough for you. So again, you know, a lot of these industrial controllers are insecure by design. So a lot of the vulnerabilities are rather moot. In addition, if we look at the network architecture, you know, the true operational impact of a lot of advisories is broken down here, where we see just 9% of advisories from last year were actually in software or hardware that I would say is high likelihood initial targets. Those would be things like data historians, maybe you know, OPC tunneling software or OPC software that's meant for providing industrial data kind of out to the corporate network so that the C-blank-O can, you know, review production data, as well as things like industrial firewalls, industrial VPN appliances that are meant to provide remote access to the most sensitive equipment. So just 9% of those advisories are really in that high likelihood area. 40% of those advisories from 2019 were in the actual engineering workstation and operator station software. Those are kind of like outside of the PLC still, but things that would talk directly to your industrial controllers. So they aren't as likely to be exposed to upstream networks, but you know, they are things to think about patching, because you might have a lot of folks within your organization that are actually using legitimate remote access to those resources, hopefully only in emergencies, but they still might be using some sort of remote access to those workstations. And then a full 37% of advisories that we reviewed in 2019 were in that kind of deeply embedded field equipment, right? Those industrial controllers, sensors themselves, as well as the kind of networking equipment that is used for connecting up to those industrial controllers, like industrial hardened network switches and that sort of thing. So, you know, looking at this list, it's like, well, there's only really 9% of advisories that are really high likelihood to be used for initial infiltration anyway. Those would probably be the most important to put on your patching list versus the rest. And I think I had mentioned before talking about kind of crown jewel assessment. I think Selena is going to be talking a bit more about that.
Yeah, so thanks, Reid. Yeah, so when you're talking about sort of generating or being able to sort of use threat intelligence, you want to kind of think about the high value assets. And these crown jewels will really vary by industry and company, as well as the motivations for attacking them. So data historians, for instance, well, these will record and retrieve production and process data. It also stores a lot of information in a database that you know can be interesting for a manufacturing, for instance, adversary. That kind of has this sort of economic motivation behind it. Chemical processing, they might be most concerned about intellectual property, and so whatever is sort of protecting or you know relating to this chemical processing, for instance, where they store the chemicals and you know what type of the safety controllers, like this type of thing. How would that you know, be a crown jewel, for instance. And then finally, safety controls. Certainly we have seen this definitely with Xenotime and Trisis. That was a huge thing. But again, safety controls are just fundamental to the process and keep people in the community safe and should be sort of considered this sort of crown jewel asset. So when you are trying to sort of operationalize, you know, the information that you're getting, right? So let's say that you have received a threat intelligence report from your provider. and you want to think to yourself, okay, what should I do? This affects me. How do I move forward with this? What do I do about this? Can I find this in my own environment, and can I prevent this from potentially being exploited? So you want to kind of start off by developing a hunting hypothesis based on an understanding of the adversary's behavior. Based on this intelligence report that you have received in your SOC, I want to create a hypothesis. So for instance, kind of going back to talking about the third-party stuff, if I increase the number of third-party service providers with access to my OT network, then this will provide adversaries additional avenues of access to my sensitive processes. So what do you do about that? You're going to want to, start off by identifying the third-party service provider and vendor relationship connections as kind of like a starting point for detecting this sort of malicious activity. And I also kind of want to use this slide to respond to a question that we've gotten regarding third-party access to these industrial automation and control systems. Let me pull that up. Sorry. What would you recommend as a control to govern the security of laptops and OEMs coming on site for firmware upgrades? So again, that's a great thing that we can kind of incorporate into our hypothesis and our defense within our own environment. So there are some things, that you can put in place. Certainly you want to be able to identify the vendor and contractor access across the board, right? So regardless of whether they might be potentially vulnerable or potentially targeted, this is very crucial to sort of understanding your network and gaining visibility within your network. So after doing that, kind of consider the sort of network segmentation to sort of isolate the vendor and contractor access and limit it as much as possible. They should only have access to necessary systems, whatever they are going to be working on or communicating with. And you also want to implement different sort of access controls and monitoring for any sort of unusual behavior or unusual activity, sort of leaving this vendor enclave that you have established within your environment. Of course, make sure that you're implementing the principle of least privilege, right? Like not giving the vendor access to things that they shouldn't be having, certainly. And you also kind of want to set a baseline, like of activity that you expect to observe within your network once a third party sort of comes in to gain access to your system, right? So you want to make sure that it's scheduled. You want to make sure that everyone involved in IT and OT security is aware of this work being done. You want to make sure that they have established again, the principle of least privilege. And you also kind of want to baseline that activity on whatever your OT network monitoring platform is and say, okay, this is what it looks like when this vendor is in my environment, and any deviation from this baseline could potentially be anomalous, if not suspicious. So I hope that answered your question, Paul. It was perfectly timed for this slide.
Yeah, so, part of what Selena was talking about earlier was threat intelligence has to be actionable, right? And so there's a bunch of stuff that goes into making actionable threat intelligence. And part of that is still making sure that you have sufficient visibility into your OT network. But you also need to be mindful of the why and what do I do of threat intelligence, the sort of actionable bit. And so the why is, saying, hey, I either have threat activity that's targeting me, or I have vulnerabilities that are relevant. And you need to make sure that your IT folks understand, what are the actual kind of impacts and maybe even political context of a threat intelligence report. But you also need to understand that some of the operations folks may try to impede response, right? They may say, hey, great, there's a vulnerability. We may not have the best asset inventory management, and they may throw up some barriers or impediments saying like, hey, vulnerability scanning is something that can break our systems. Well, there's ways around that, right? If you want to build up an asset inventory list or even do vulnerability scanning, there are some great papers from Digital Bond, for example, one of my former employers, on using like a sampling approach in vulnerability scanning. They may say like, oh, we don't have, endpoint detection, but there can be things that you can do, like if you have a threat intelligence report, you may incorporate some form of kind of investigative playbook saying like, hey, okay, fine, you don't have like some sort of endpoint detection actually installed on potential target workstations, But here is sort of a playbook on how to quickly run through. Like, let's say you saw some network activity and you want to go quickly investigate the workstation. Sort of here is what these activity groups are up to. Here's what they do once they gain access to a system. So these are the sorts of things that you can start looking for. And again, with the vulnerability management, you know, the ability to apply patches is something that may not happen right away. They might say, oh, our next plant downtime isn't for another 6 months, or maybe isn't even for a year. And it could even be like, hey, we have a maintenance window in 6 months, but it is 100% booked. There is no time for applying patches to stuff. This is where having a threat intelligence report that includes those kind of temporary mitigations and even detections, and better yet, even detections with some sort of limited playbook that says, look for this sort of activity. For example, a non-engineering workstation making some type of connection to an industrial controller. You may have that as a detection, but you also want some sort of limited playbook to come with that to say, like, okay, if that is the case, then these are the signs and symptoms to look for on that non-engineering workstation to kind of help figure out what may have gone wrong.
So, how do you operationalize OT threat intelligence? I kind of want to encourage you after this talk, if you haven't already, to consider or to develop an organizational program around threat intelligence that actually includes vulnerability management, that includes, intelligence based on ICS-specific vulnerabilities. This should include both OT and IT security teams. This should include stakeholders from across the organization who would benefit from any sort of threat intelligence reporting. And recognize that threat intelligence is a major function of risk management. You can use the information that is provided by whoever your intelligence provider is to say, okay, I am willing to accept this risk, or okay, in order to reduce risk, we need to follow these mitigations and implement this sort of threat behavior detections within our environment. And threat intelligence must not only report on activity, but advise countermeasures and mitigations for the defended environment. That is so crucial to consumers of threat intelligence. Again, I kind of have to import this on you, intelligence without the so what, without action, information without the action to be taken is just information. It's not intelligence. And you really want to be able to say, all right, here's what happened. Here's how it affects me. Here's what I can do. And so to make sure that, the entity that you're receiving the threat intelligence from is aware of how industrial operations work, how the OT network is different from the sort of IT piece, to be able to ensure that you're getting the right mitigations and defensive recommendations from folks who actually know what it's like to be in an operations environment. And then finally, threat intelligence can be shared up and down the organization, including executives, human resources, as well as the SOC, right? Intelligence is not just for defenders. You can make business decisions off of threat intelligence. You can make sure that your HR is aware of potential LinkedIn phishing activity that is going around that could be impacting your specific industry, things like that. It shouldn't just be siloed to security operations. And it also sort of helps, as you go through the different management levels to say, okay, I'm hearing about this thing that's impacting industrial controls. What does this mean for us? And then you're able to sort of provide this written document and this report. It says, hey boss, here it is. Here's how it impacts us, and here's what we're doing about it. So it's really for proactive security as much as it is for oftentimes reactive security. But an organizational program around threat intelligence is so crucial and so helpful in managing risk, as well as as implementing defense to protect against any ICS targeting adversaries. And then finally, in conclusion, the goals of threat intelligence are going to be largely similar for IT and OT. And the attacker capabilities, motivations, and attack surface can really vary between IT and OT targeting adversaries. So the security and vulnerability decisions within the IT and OT will be made differently, even if it's based on the same intelligence. It takes everyone working together to make ICS entities and the communities they operate in and support safer and more secure. And again, I hope you guys can kind of take away some of these main sort of to-do items from this presentation. If you aren't already, maybe consider incorporating threat intelligence into your security operations. But thank you so much for coming to hang out. And thank you, Sans, for having us as well. And I think we're going to take some questions now.
Yep, great job, everybody. So actually, you answered most of them in your presentations and doing it live. There's a couple here at the end, though. So for everybody else, feel free to jump on and ask sort of some of your last-minute questions. The first one up is, do you have a process to verify third-party access? So this is, again, from Paul. Reid, you took the first swipe at the first part of this question. Do either one of you have sort of views on third-party access verification? Reid?
Ooh, yeah, it's a challenge. You know, I've seen remote access done in a variety of different ways. Third-party access is a super challenging subject. Ooh, boy, a formal process, like I don't think there's something where it's going to be one process fits all. I have seen third-party access in the generation space where vendors have said, you know, hey, we need to have this access all the time to generation equipment. And after some back and forth, you know, we kind of negotiated between the customer who is, you know, running the equipment and the OEM who actually made it, and made something that would work where they would have, basically the OEM would have windows for that third-party access, and those windows would be monitored. And the rest of the time, they would have no ability to, you know, write or make changes to the industrial equipment. I think that's probably one of the more prickly ones, just in the sense that, you know, it's big equipment. The vendor certainly has a desire and need to get lots of telemetry data out of the device and to even make control systems changes to the device. But I think that those sorts of discussions are ones to have with the vendor where, you know, maybe you could do some sort of remote access that certainly isn't on all the time, that, you know, you have maintenance windows basically where that third party is allowed into, and then you could do some data collection from that access to make sure that nothing illegitimate is happening at that time.
I would also probably point out too that when we're talking about visibility, right, this kind of goes back to understanding what's on your network and knowing, you know, what's on your network and having that really good visibility. I don't mean to, you know, like promote the Dragos platform. I don't mean to make this a sales pitch, but one of the things that the Dragos platform does, which is an ICS security or an ICS specific sort of monitoring security tool for your OT, is that we do sort of identify various vendors, and you're able to sort of use those OT sort of specific threat monitoring and detection services like the platform, the Dragos platform, to be able to sort of identify those types of connections, those types of communications, and you know, get that visibility into your network and say, okay, who is communicating with me? Who has this access? Is there any access that should not be there, or should it be more restricted? Is, you know, kind of starting from it sounds very basic, but just understanding what is on your network so you can better defend it.
Perfect, thanks. And then the next one is about open source feed. So we know the Dragos does that, so we'll put that to the side for a second, but where do you all get additional insight on OT related threat feeds or data, especially from open source? I know it's kind of limited, but any pointers you have on there would be useful.
Yeah, I have a ton. So I actually, funny enough, I presented at RSA on OSINT for ICS security with my colleague Amy Baitlick, and that presentation is actually available online. You can find it at RSA. But just kind of off the top of my head, certainly news, kind of Google dorking a lot is very, very helpful. Certainly, you know, VirusTotal, things like GitHub, even Twitter is super useful for intelligence sharing and intelligence gathering. Also, one of my favorite sources of threat intelligence is in financial documents, filings that our companies are sort of required to file with their sort of respective governments to kind of talk about every quarter their sort of financial situation. But you also find a lot of interesting stuff about security, potential cyber attacks that are kind of hidden in those filings as well. I'm kind of trying to think, you know, that's kind of a lot, but certainly tools, you know, you have like Maltego, things like that are available for practitioners as well. And some various like OSINT tools. There's a website out there that has a lot of things that you can use as well. But those are kind of my main things. And if you are interested in that particular piece, I encourage you to check out that talk.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're out of time. Thank you both for your presentation. Thank you, everybody in the SANS community, for dialing in and taking a listen to this content. Thanks again for your time, and the slides and recording will be available again, posted at the same link that you used to register for the webinar. Thanks for your time, and take care.